Dawn over the Dakota Valley. Snow lay unbroken from ridge to ridge, and every chimney in Stonebrook Hollow bled its thin gray thread into a sky the color of struck iron. Every chimney but one. Half a mile up the rise, past a crooked cottonwood bowed under 6 days of ice, a single cabin sat dark. No smoke, no shimmer of heat above the brick. The frost that lay across every other pane in the valley had not touched its window. Inside, a woman moved barefoot across the floorboards. Deep brown skin, a gingham head tie. The soles of her feet found wood that should have been cold enough to stop a heart. The wood was warm. She did not smile. Down at the pass, a mule labored uphill through the drifts, ridden by a man in a buffalo coat, his beard already white with his own breath. He had come to find a body. He would find something else. The frost came down on Stonebrook Hollow, the way judgment came down in the old sermons, patient and total, settling into every seam a person had failed to close. On the morning of December 12th, 1881, the windows of every cabin in the valley wore the same brittle white lace on the inside of the glass, the kind of pattern that meant the fires inside had lost their argument with the night. Every window in the valley, that is, except one. A half-mile up the rise, past the crooked cottonwood the settlers used as a landmark, a small structure sat under a cap of snow with no smoke lifting from its chimney and no frost feathering its single pane. Inside, a woman walked across the floorboards in her bare feet, and the wood beneath her soles was warm. She did not smile. She did not need to. She simply set down her tin cup, drew back the shutter, and looked out at a valley that had in one form or another been trying to kill her for the better part of 2 years. The image of her standing there dark against the frost-lit glass would be the last thing this story had ever needed to prove. Everything else was how she got there and what it cost. To understand the woman at the window, one had to go back 20 months to a spring that had smelled of thaw and horse sweat and possibility. Her name was Odessa Ridgway. She had come into the world in 1849 in a pine board cabin outside Elizabeth City, North Carolina, the daughter of a man who had been someone else's property until the year he was 32, and a woman who had learned to read from a Bible hidden in a flour barrel. Odessa had inherited her father's steadiness and her mother's stubborn belief that the shape of a thing could be studied until it gave up its secret. She had learned her letters at a Freedmen's Bureau schoolhouse, where the roof leaked in 3 places, and the teacher, a widow from Boston, refused to end lessons until every child could spell the word Constitution. By the time Odessa was grown, she carried 2 things nobody could take from her: the ability to read any word set in front of her, and the habit of writing down what she saw. She married Ephraim Ridgway in the spring of 1878 in a small ceremony at a church in Nicodemus, Kansas, a town built by black settlers on the flat grass west of the Missouri. Ephraim was 32, then 3 years her elder, a trapper and part-time carpenter, with hands that looked as if they had been carved out of walnut. He was born in Tennessee and had walked out of a burning barn when he was 10 years old, carrying his younger sister on his back. And he did not talk about that year and did not need to. What he did instead was work and listen, and when he thought no one was watching, sing under his breath in a low tenor that made the horses turn their ears. Odessa had first noticed him because he was the only man at a barn raising who thanked the women who brought the food by name one by one. She had married him for smaller and larger reasons than that, but that was the first. They stayed in Nicodemus long enough to understand it could not hold them. The town was full of good people and thinning soil, and every year more families arrived than the land could feed. In the fall of 1879, a man passing through spoke of the Dakota territory of country so open a person could ride 2 days without hearing another voice of valleys, where the timber came right down to the creeks and no one had yet stuck a plow in the loam. Ephraim listened. Odessa listened harder. That winter, they sold the cast iron stove her mother had given them as a wedding gift, packed what they could into a wagon, and pointed the mules north into a country that would not know their names when they arrived and would not much care to learn them. They came into Stonebrook Hollow in April of 1880. The valley was a long, shallow bowl in the western fold of the Dakota country, held between two low ridges of pine and hemmed at its south end by a creek that ran fast in the melt and low the rest of the year. There were 7 cabins scattered along its length when the ridgeways arrived, none of them within sight of another, each pinned to its own piece of ground by the kind of quiet that made a person's ears ring. Their nearest neighbor was a Missouri farmer named Amos T. Bow, whose wife Ruth kept a stand of hens and a face that gave away nothing on first meeting. Amos had come out of the war on the wrong side of most things, and he treated the Ridgeways at first the way a man treats weather. He cannot change with a need and a narrow eye, in a determination to keep his own fences mended. He needed a second pair of hands for the summer wheat, and Ephraim needed a place to learn the country from someone who had already broken his teeth on it. That was at the start, the whole of their arrangement. They built the first cabin in 5 days, the 3 men working from a plan Ephraim drew in the dirt with a stick. 16 feet by 20 logs notched at the corners, moss and mud packed into the chinks, a stone hearth on the north wall. To catch the worst of the wind, one window covered in oiled paper because glass in that country cost more than a good rifle. The floor was dirt tamped down with the flat of a shovel until it rang under a boot heel. It was by every measure the country used a good cabin, which is to say it was adequate, and adequate was the highest praise the country gave. Odessa remembered pressing her palm to the last log the day they set the ridgepole, feeling the sap, still weeping out of the cut end, and thinking that a house was only ever a bargain, a person made with the weather. She did not yet know how expensive that bargain could become. It was in those first weeks that she began the notebook. Ephraim had bought her a plain black ledger at the trading post in Blackthorn Ford, a town 2 days' ride south that consisted of a general store, a smithy, a sawmill by the creek, and a saloon. Nobody bothered to name because it was the only one. He had meant the ledger for household accounts, thinking she would keep the tally of flour and salt and lead. She used it for that on the first 2 pages. On the 3rd page, she began to write down other things: the hour at which the water in the wash bucket iced over, the direction the snow melted first off the roof shakes, how long a hearthstone stayed warm to the touch after the last coal winked out. She wrote these things in a small, neat hand in columns with dates. Ephraim caught her at it one evening in the 2nd week of June, bent over the ledger with a nub of pencil, her lower lip caught between her teeth. He leaned in the doorway and watched her a long moment before he spoke, and his voice, when it came, was warm with an amusement that did not carry any barb. His shoulder brushed the jam as he tilted his head. "You writing down the wind now, Della?" She did not look up. Her pencil moved another line. "Something like that." His arms folded across his chest, patient. "Feels to me like you're drawing a map for the Lord himself." Then she did look up. In the corner of her mouth lifted the barest quarter-inch, which for Odessa was the equivalent of another woman's laughter. Her eyes stayed serious even when the mouth moved. "The Lord already drew the map, Ephraim. I'm just reading it." He shook his head, smiling at the floor, and let her be. He told the story later at the Tebow table, and Ruth's mouth did not move, but her eyes did, and something passed between the 2 women that was less than friendship and more than a truce. From that night on, Ephraim called her his mapmaker when he wanted to soften a thing, and she called him her carpenter when she wanted the same, and the ledger grew heavier on its spine week by week. That first summer taught them what the country would offer and what it would not. The soil in the flat between the ridges was thin over a bedrock of gray shale, and the wheat they put in with Amos came up short and bitter. The fur, though, was good. Ephraim ran a line of traps up the North Ridge in the fall and came back with beaver and marten pelts that he stretched on frames along the south wall of the cabin. And when he stood in the doorway with his hat pushed back and blood on his cuffs, Odessa thought he looked like a man who had finally found the country his hands belonged in. She salted the meat. She stitched a coat for herself out of the smaller skins. She kept a ledger and she kept the fire, and she watched him ride out at dawn and back at dusk with a feeling in her chest that she did not have a name for and did not need to name. The first winter came in November, brutal in the ordinary way. Nights went to 20 below. Mornings warmed to 5 above if the sun cleared the ridge and stayed at 0 if it did not. The cabin performed the way every cabin in the valley performed. Fire fed constantly, the interior held a livable warmth. Fire slackened, the interior dropped degree by degree toward the temperature of the air outside. Odessa and Ephraim took the nights in shifts without ever formally agreeing to. He tended the fire until midnight. She rose at midnight and tended it until dawn. Neither of them slept the full clock through from November to March, and by the time the creek broke in April, they were both thinner and quieter than they had been in the fall. But they were alive, and the mules were alive, and the pelts were stacked in the corner, and that in Stonebrook Hollow was what winter meant. In the spring of 1881, Ephraim ranged further. The trapping was better up in the broken country west of the ridge, where the beaver were less shy, and he began to be gone 3 and 4 days at a stretch, riding out with a pack mule and a bedroll, and the small, flat Bible Odessa had pressed into his hands the first time he vanished for more than a night. She did not tell him she was frightened. She did not need to. She counted the days on the doorframe with a splinter of charcoal, 4 marks, and then a bath, heated on the stove, 5 marks in a longer bath. And when the 6 marks came, she went to the window and stood there until his shape resolved out of the tree line. This was the arrangement. It worked. It worked all summer, and it worked through the fall. And Odessa's ledger grew to the point that she had to stitch in extra leaves cut from the end papers of an almanac because she had begun to notice things she had not known she was watching. She noticed that the north wall of the cabin was always the coldest, even in July, because the sun never touched it. She noticed that the hearthstones held their heat 2 hours longer than the wooden benches by the door, and that the tin ladle hung on its nail was cold within minutes of the fire's dying. She noticed that the packed dirt of the floor never truly warmed no matter how large the fire, and that on the coldest nights the cold seemed to rise out of the floor itself as if the earth had a supply of it laid up somewhere and was letting it out through the boards. These were not observations she shared with Ephraim because she did not yet know what they added up to. They were pieces of something whose shape she could not see. She only knew that she had begun to think of heat as a thing with a shape, a substance that moved through the world the way water moved through a creek seeking its lower place. Ruth Tebow came by in October of that year to trade a jar of pickled beets for a length of the calico Odessa had brought up from Kansas. The 2 women stood in the yard talking about the coming winter and the price of coffee, and the way Ruth's oldest boy had shot up an inch in a month, and Ruth, in the middle of some sentence about her sister-in-law in St. Joseph, stopped and looked at Odessa hard and said something that Odessa would carry for the rest of her life. "You're a careful woman, Mrs. Ridgway. Careful women get through. I've seen the other kind, and they don't." Odessa turned the calico over in her hands. Her fingertips smoothed a crease that was not there. "I aim to get through, Mrs. Tebow." Ruth nodded once, a woman's nod, curt and complete, and rode her mule home. Odessa did not know then that the sentence had been a benediction and a warning, and that within 2 months she would find out which. December came in mild. That was the first strange thing. The first week of the month saw daytime highs above freezing, and nights that only dipped into the teens, and the men in the valley began to speak of an easy winter, the way men speak when they want the weather to hear them and take pity. Ephraim rode out on the 5th of December to check the far line of traps in the broken country, meaning to be back by the 8th. He kissed Odessa on the forehead at the door, adjusted the wool scarf she had knitted him around his throat, and swung up onto the sorrel gelding with the easy grace of a man who had done the thing 1,000 times. She stood in the yard and watched him go until he was a dark thumbprint against the pale grass at the top of the ridge, and then she went inside and put the ledger on the table and wrote down the date and the temperature and the sky because that was what she did. On the 7th of December, the sky turned the color of old lead. On the 8th, the temperature fell 40 degrees between noon and dusk, so fast that the well rope froze solid in the pulley. On the 9th, the storm came down out of the north with the sound of a freight train, and Ephraim Ridgway did not come home. Odessa did not go looking for him. She wanted to, and she did not, because she had been raised by a father who had made her memorize the distances between things and the times it took to cross them. And she knew that a woman on foot in that storm would not last 3 hours and would help no one. She fed the fire. She checked the shutters. She melted snow on the stove because the well was gone. She read the small Bible aloud in the empty cabin because the sound of her own voice was the only thing between her and the sound of the wind, which had begun to make a noise against the north wall that was neither howl nor moan, but something in between, a note held so long it stopped being sound and started being weather. On the 10th, she began to cough. It came up out of her chest without warning while she bent over the fire, and by afternoon her forehead was hot to her own hand. She knew what fever was. She had nursed her mother through pneumonia when she was 19 and had lost her, and she recognized the way this thing sat in her lungs, low and patient, and she understood that she would have to fight it and keep the fire alive at the same time alone because Ephraim was somewhere in the storm and no one else in the valley knew she was sick. She did the things a person did. She drank water. She wrapped herself in every blanket they owned. She banked the fire high in the early evening and made herself stay upright in the chair beside it, because to lie down was to sleep and to sleep was to let the fire go. The wind did not stop. The wind did not even slow. Somewhere past midnight of the 10th going into the 11th, her hands began to shake so badly she dropped a piece of split pine on her foot and did not feel it land. She looked at the wood on her instep. She looked at the fire, which was still burning, still tall. She reasoned in the small, dim way a fevered mind reasons, that if she added the largest log in the box and pulled the blankets tighter, she could close her eyes for a quarter of an hour and the fire would hold. She lifted the log. She placed it. She sat back down. She meant to count to 900 and open her eyes. She did not open her eyes for 6 hours. What woke her was the cold. It was not the cold of a room where the fire had died. It was the cold of the country itself, the cold that lived outside and had been waiting patient as a creditor for the door to open. She sat up in the chair and her breath went out in front of her in a plume as thick as pipe smoke. The blankets on her shoulders were rimmed white where her breath had settled on them in the night. She turned her head and the hearth was gray, and the log she had placed was a black bone lying on top of an ash bed that gave no heat back to her hand when she held it close. She stood. Her legs did not want her. The floor was so cold through the soles of her wool stockings that it seemed to burn. The fever had broken sometime in the night, sweated out into the wool, and she was a woman standing in her own house looking at a hearth full of ash, and outside the wind had stopped, and outside the sky was the pale blue of a hard, clear morning after a killing storm. She should not have been alive. She understood that with a clarity that felt separate from her body, the way a person understands a piece of arithmetic. If the storm had held another night, If her fever had risen another degree, if the blankets had been one fewer, she would have gone out sitting up in the chair the way her mother's oldest brother had gone out in Virginia in the winter of '63, quietly without complaint, the fire in front of him black. She had been spared by inches and by weather, and she knew it, and she did not yet know what she had been spared for. Amos Tebow came in the noon hour. She heard the mule, first the tired step of an animal that had been ridden hard through drifts, and then the boots on the yard, and then the pause outside her door that told her before he spoke it that he was not there with a neighborly errand. She opened the door before he knocked. His hat was in his hands. Snow was still on the shoulders of his coat. He looked at her, and his eyes did the thing eyes do when a man has to say a sentence he has said before to other people and hopes never to say again. His mouth worked once. "Mrs. Ridgway." She said nothing. He tried again, and this time the words came. "They found Ephraim up on the west side of the broken ground, yesterday near a fall of pine. He was under an overhang out of the wind as best he could get. He'd tried to build a fire. It didn't catch. It looked like he sat there a while." She did not sit down. She did not weep. She heard the words, and she understood the words, and she watched Amos Tebow standing in her doorway holding his hat with both hands, as if it were a fragile animal he did not want to drop. The cold came in past his shoulders. Behind him the yard was blazing white in the noon sun. Her voice came out even. It sounded like her mother's voice from far away. "Where is he now?" "Reverend McCabe took him to the smith's shed in Blackthorn Ford. Ground's frozen. We'll need 2 days on the hillside if you want him up top." "I want him up top." Amos nodded. He turned his hat in his hands. "Ma'am, Ruth says come stay. Till the burying." "Thank her for me. I'll stay here." He looked at her a long moment. He looked past her at the cold hearth and at the blankets on the chair and at the plume her breath still made in the air of her own front room. Something in his face moved. He did not try to argue. He put his hat back on his head. "I'll send word when we've broken the ground." He left. She closed the door. She stood with her forehead against the wood for the space of one long breath, and then she walked to the hearth and knelt down and began to lay a fire with the deliberation of a woman setting a table for a meal she did not intend to eat. It took them 2 days to break the frozen earth on the little rise above the cabin. Amos and Reverend Absalom McCabe rode up from Blackthorn Ford with Josiah Wetherall, the old smith, in tow because Josiah had come to know Ephraim over the summer through the mending of trap chains and had asked to help. The 4 of them built fires on the burial spot and let them burn down and scraped away the ash and built new fires, and slowly the ground thawed enough to yield to the pick. Odessa did not help with the digging. She stood at the head of the plot in her mother's dark shawl, the ledger tucked into the crook of her elbow, the way another woman would have carried a hymn book, and she watched. She had never seen Josiah Wetherall before that afternoon. He was a broad, gray-headed man in his middle 60s with the hands of a smith and the eyes of a man who had watched the world do a great deal and had made his peace with almost none of it. He did not speak to her at first. He worked. When they lowered Ephraim wrapped in the good wool blanket she had picked out that morning into the ground, McCabe read from Psalms in a voice that the wind kept trying to take, and Josiah stood at the foot of the grave with his hat in his hand and his lips moving to words no one else heard. When they were finished and the earth was mounded and Amos had gone to see to the mules, Josiah walked over to where Odessa stood and looked down at her ledger and then up at her face. His voice was low, gravel, soft. "You writing him down, ma'am?" She looked at the ledger. She had not opened it. She had only been holding it the way a person holds a hand. Not yet. He nodded slowly the way an old man nods when he has decided something without saying what. "When you're ready, you come to the shop. Blackthorn Ford. Ask anybody. There's things I want to say to you that I can't say today." She met his eyes. He met hers. There was no pity in his face. That she would think later was the first mercy anyone had done her since the door had opened. "I'll come," she said. He put his hat on. He walked to his horse. She stood at the grave until the sun dropped behind the west ridge, and then she walked down the path to her cabin, and she opened the door and she went inside, and she did not light the lamp. She sat at the table in the dark. She opened the ledger. She turned to a clean page. She wrote in her small, clear hand a single line, and she did not underline it because a thing does not need underlining when it is already the only sentence on the page. Fire died 2:14 a.m. Afram gone. Adequate is not enough. She looked at the sentence a long time. She closed the ledger. She laid her forehead down on the wood of the table, and only then, alone in the cold, in a house that had almost killed her and had killed no one, only by accident, did she allow herself to weep, and the weeping was the driest sound the house had ever heard, because there was not enough water in her to make it wet. In the days that followed, she began to see the cabin the way she had never been permitted to see it before, which was as a machine. She had thought of it up to that point as a home, which is to say, she had thought of it the way one thinks of a person one loves in the round without inventory. Now she inventoried it. She stood in the middle of the front room with the ledger open, and she wrote down its failures one by one in the order they presented themselves to her eye. There was the chinking between the third and fourth logs on the east wall, where the moss had dried and pulled back, and a finger of cold could be felt with a wetted knuckle. There was the door frame, which had been set true in June and had shifted a quarter-inch by December, opening a hairline at the top that a candle flame leaned toward when the wind was from the north. There was the paper window, which felt colder to the palm than the log wall beside it, and which radiated a cold of its own into the room, even when the outside air was still. There was the fireplace, which threw its heat up and out and drew a matching river of cold air along the floor to feed itself. There was the floor. Above all, there was the floor. She knelt and pressed her palm flat to the packed dirt beside her chair, and even through the layer of buffalo hides she had spread there, the cold came up into her hand like a hand of its own reaching back. The whole building, she wrote in the ledger that night, was designed to lose heat, not to hold it, to lose it. The fire made warmth and the building spent it, and the moment the fire slackened, the spending continued and the earnings stopped, and the balance ran out, and a woman sitting up in a chair with a fever fell asleep, and did not die only because she had wrapped herself in an accidental sufficiency of wool. The question that came to her then and would not leave her was a question so simple that she could not believe no one had asked it out loud in her hearing. Why did a cabin have to give up all of its heat the moment the fire went down? Fire made heat. Heat rose. Heat left. That was the arithmetic every man in the valley worked by. But she had seen the hearthstone stay warm for 2 hours after the coals died. She had felt the tin ladle go cold in 5 minutes. Different things gave up their heat at different rates. That was not opinion. That was observation. And if some things gave up heat slowly, then a house built out of those things or built to include those things would give up its heat slowly too. It might give up its heat over a whole night. It might carry a person sleeping or sick or absent through the hours the fire could not. It might, she thought, and this was the thought she would not write down for another week because it hurt too much to see it in ink. It might have carried Ephraim through a night if he had had somewhere like it to shelter some pocket of held warmth in the broken country west of the ridge, some overhang lined with the right kind of stone. She sat with that thought a long time. She did not resolve it. She only closed the ledger and she went to bed, and she slept badly. In the third week after the burying, Amos Tebow rode up the path with Ruth on the mule behind him, and the two of them sat at Odessa's table and drank the coffee she made without asking. and Ruth got to it with the plainness of a woman who had rehearsed the sentence on the ride over. Her hands were folded on the tabletop. Her eyes did not slide. Odessa, a colored woman alone in Dakota, does not see a second winter through. I have watched it happen twice in this valley since I came. There is a widower in Blackthorn Ford, Bertram Coleman, keeps the livery, lost his wife to the milk fever last spring. He is a decent man. He is a working man. He has asked through the Reverend whether you might sit with him at the church supper come Easter. Amos was looking into his coffee. He did not lift his eyes. He had been sent to Odessa, understood, to bear witness to the offer so that no one could later claim the offer had not been made. She turned her cup a half turn on the wood. The coffee inside did not spill. I thank you for your care, Mrs. Thibault, and I thank Mr. Coleman for his interest. Then you'll come. I did not say that. Ruth's mouth tightened. Odessa, there is no shame in what I am asking. There is only shame in freezing. Odessa set her cup down. She looked at Ruth across the table, and her voice was not sharp, but there was something under it that Ruth had not heard from her before, a quiet the way ice is quiet. Ephraim left me a question, Mrs. Thibault. I intend to answer that question before I answer any other. When I have answered it, I will consider what is next. Amos lifted his eyes then. He looked at her a long moment across the rim of his cup. Ma'am, what question? She almost smiled. She did not. She stood and she picked up the coffee pot and she poured him another measure. And she set the pot back down on the trivet with a care that had nothing to do with the pot. The one I mean to answer, Mr. Thibault. If I answer it, you'll know. Ruth stood. Her mouth was a straight line. She did not slam the door on her way out, and that restraint, Odessa understood, was a courtesy she had not been entirely sure she would receive. She watched them ride back down the path together. Ruth's back very straight on the mule behind her husband, and she felt something in her chest that was not triumph and not sorrow. It was closer to the feeling a person gets when a door closes softly and the room on the other side of it goes quiet and useful. She had been offered a life. She had refused it. She had, in the refusing, committed herself to another one whose shape she could not yet see. That night she took the ledger to the hearth and knelt beside the fire and opened it to a fresh page, and she began to write not a column of observations, but a list of questions. What material held heat longest to the touch? What material carried heat slowest through its body? Whether a floor could be raised? Whether a foundation could hold warmth the way a hearthstone did? Whether the ground itself, which she had begun to think about since Ruth's second visit, had reminded her of the root cellar behind the Thibault house? Whether the ground itself below a certain depth was warmer in winter than the air above it? She did not yet know the answers to any of these questions. She knew only that they were the right questions. That was the beginning. She wrote a small line under the last question and closed the book. In the low red light of the coals, her face was still. Outside above the ridge, the December stars were sharp as split flint, and in the valley below her, in 6 other cabins, 6 other fires burned into the small hours tended by hands that took it for granted that a fire must be tended because that was how the country worked, and no one had told them any different, and no one yet had thought to ask why. January in Stonebrook Hollow was a long white throat, and Odessa spent it inside a house she had begun to distrust the way a rider distrusts a horse that has once tried to throw her. She kept the fire alive without ceremony, feeding it in the same measured rhythm she had used all her life, but her attention had moved somewhere else entirely. She was no longer trying to be warm. She was trying to understand warmth. The ledger opened every night on the table, and every night the columns lengthened, and by the 3rd week of the new year, she had filled 20 pages with numbers and small drawings, and none of them yet meant anything, and all of them she believed meant something. She kept a piece of iron wire bent into a hook by the hearth, and she used it to move a river stone she had brought in from the creek onto the coals for exactly an hour, and then off. And then she timed how long the stone stayed warm to her palm. She did the same with a slab of pine, a horseshoe Amos had given Ephraim to hang above the door, a lump of clay she had dug from the bank. The stone held its heat for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The horseshoe held it for 11 minutes. The pine 16. The clay 40. She wrote these numbers down in the ledger, and she stared at them until her eyes ached, and she felt for the first time since the burying the small dry click of a mind finding a track. The stove had a language. She had not been taught it. She was learning it by ear. By the last week of January, her flour was down to a third of a sack, and the salt pork had a rind on it that Ephraim would have laughed at. She had been trapping the near line herself in a way she had never done before, going out at first light with his second rifle across her back, and coming home stiff-fingered and half-blind from the glare, and the fur she took was thin, because the good stretches lay in country she did not know well enough to travel alone in that snow. She counted the pelts. She counted the days to the March thaw. She counted the coffee. She reached the conclusion any Dakota woman would have reached, which was that she had to ride to Blackthorn Ford before the end of March or eat her seed corn, and she preferred to ride. She waited for a break in the weather that came in the third week of March, a stretch of 3 days when the wind fell and the sun came up strong enough to soften the crust. And on the second morning of that stretch, she saddled the sorrel Ephraim had ridden into the storm, whose return riderless 3 days after his death was a thing she had trained herself not to remember, and she pointed his nose south. The mule went behind on a lead carrying a bundle of the season's pelts. She rode without singing because Ephraim had been the singer between them. What she did instead as the sorrel climbed the low pass out of the hollow was talk to the ledger under her coat quietly the way another woman might talk to a rosary. She said into the collar of her coat the sentence she had written the night before and had not been able to sleep for. If the ground below the frost holds warmth of its own, then a floor set into that ground or held above the coldest of it could steal from what the ground already owns. She did not know yet that she was right. She only knew that she meant to find out. Amos Thibault's farm lay a half hour off her road, and she took the detour because she had run out of dried apple and because she had a question she had been carrying since the last snow. Ruth answered the door with an infant on her hip that Odessa had not seen in a month, and the two women stood on the porch a moment looking at each other, and then Ruth stepped as it and said without softening it, the door opened wide. "Come in. Amos is at the barn." She did not offer coffee, which was a small refusal, and she did not turn her back, which was a smaller courtesy. Odessa took off her hat and did not sit. She had been thinking. All the ride down the pass of the shape of a hole in the side of a hill and the temperature of the air inside it, and she went at it now with the plainness the country had taught her. She stood in Ruth's kitchen with her gloves in her hand, and she asked what she had come to ask. "Mrs. Thibault, your root cellar, might I see it before I go on to town?" Ruth looked at her a long second over the baby's head. Something moved behind Ruth's eyes that was neither warmth nor coldness, but a kind of recalculation, the look of a woman deciding whether a strangeness in another woman was the kind she needed to worry about or the kind she could ignore. She set the child down in a wooden pen by the stove. She wiped her hands on her apron. Her voice had less starch in it than it had the last time the two of them had spoken. "Amos dug it deep, 8 feet in. There's a candle by the door." She led Odessa out through the yard past the hen house to a low door set into the side of the hill behind the barn, framed in slabs of hewn oak and hung on iron hinges that Josiah Wetherall had almost certainly made. Ruth lifted the latch. The door swung out on a cold that was not the cold of the yard. It was a cold with something inside it, a held quality, a stillness. The two women went down 4 stone steps into a room the size of a small bedroom, curved at the ceiling, where the earth arched over the excavation, and Odessa's first breath in that room stopped her where she stood. Outside the yard, air had bitten at her cheeks. Down here, her breath did not plume. She could hear her own pulse in the back of her ears. Wooden shelves along both walls held crocks of pickled beans and barrels of turnips packed in sand, and a wheel of hard cheese under a cloth, and the air smelled of earth and root, and a faint animal sweetness of stored apples going soft. Ruth stood at the door with her arms folded. Never freezes, never gets warm. Amos says the earth keeps its own summer down here. I never bothered him about it. It works. Odessa laid her bare palm against the packed earth wall. The wall was cool, not cold, cool. She held her hand there until her fingers stopped tingling from the outside air, and then she felt the wall's own temperature coming back at her steady, unlike anything else she had touched in a Dakota December. She thought, and she did not say it, that the earth had a temperature, and that the temperature was not the temperature of the air, and that a house built into or upon this reservoir would begin its winter with warmth already banked, and that no one in the valley, herself included, had ever thought of a house that way, because a house was above the ground where a person could see it, and the ground was under the ground where a person did not think to look. She wrote nothing down. She would write it later. What she did in that root cellar was press her forehead briefly to the cold wall and close her eyes and then straighten and thank Ruth Tebow by name for a courtesy she did not know she had extended. Mrs. Tebow, this is a kindness. I will not forget it. Ruth's face did not soften. Her voice did. Ride safe to town, Mrs. Ridgway. She rode into Blackthorn Ford at mid-afternoon with her shadow falling long ahead of the sorrel's hooves. The town in March was a study in mud, a single wide street of half-frozen ruts running past a general store, a smithy with its doors thrown open to the thaw, a sawmill down by the creek where a water wheel had begun to run again. For the season, a livery, a saloon of the same wordless kind that all such saloons were, and at the far end of the street, a small clapboard church with a white spire that had settled a half-degree off true and had never been corrected. She tied the sorrel at the rail outside the general store, hitched the mule alongside, and went in with her chin level and the bundle of pelts under her arm. Harlan Beebe stood behind the counter in a canvas apron, and he watched her come the way a man watches a dog he has not made up his mind about. He had a wide face gone pink at the jowls from the wood stove behind him, and eyes the pale color of skimmed milk. There were 2 men leaning at the far end of the counter, one of them chewing tobacco, the other one whittling at a shingle without looking up. She laid the pelts on the plank. She laid a small folded list beside them. Her voice was quiet, level, businesslike, the voice her father had taught her to use in any store she did not own. I'll trade the fur for what's on the list, and I'll need a keg of 10-penny nails and a bundle of shakes and 40 foot of oakum for chinking and a bag of coffee. Beebe looked at the pelts. He looked at the list. He looked at her. He picked up the pelts one at a time and turned them over as if he were being asked to buy them wet. He set them down. He rubbed his chin with the back of his wrist. His voice, when it came, was the voice a man uses when he wants the other men in the room to hear him. Prices are up on nails since Christmas, and I got to charge extra for handling on the fur. She waited. The other 2 men had stopped their chewing and their whittling. Beebe named a price. It was not the price he would have named to Amos Tebow. It was not the price he had named to Ephraim in November. It was exactly near enough as made no difference twice. She did not blink. She looked at him a long moment, and she said evenly, the words dropping like small stones on the counter one at a time. Mr. Beebe, Give me the goods at the same price you gave my husband the last time he stood where I am." He smiled. It was not a good smile. "Ma'am, your husband is not standing where you are." Something in her chest went very still. She did not answer him. She reached into her coat and she took out the small purse she had made from a scrap of Ephraim's hunting coat, and she counted the coins she had onto the plank in the exact amount he had named. And she did it slowly so the two men at the end of the counter could see that she could count and that she was choosing to pay and that she was choosing to remember. Then she said quietly enough that only Bibi heard it and loudly enough that he did not miss a word. "You'll take my money today, Mr. Bibi. I'll remember what it cost me, and so will other people." He held her gaze. He did not answer. He gathered the coin. He filled her order. She carried the goods out to the mule herself, though he could have helped because she did not intend to give him the chance to say later that he had. Outside, the two men on the porch of the saloon, two doors down, had watched her cross the street with the bundle of nails, and one of them made a sound in his throat, and the other one laughed low in a way that would have made Ephraim tighten his jaw. She walked past them without changing her pace. She had loaded half the mule when a voice came out of the open doorway of the smithy across the street, low, unhurried pitch to carry only as far as she needed to hear it. "Miss, come get warm a minute before you ride." She turned. Josiah Wetherall stood in the wide doorway with his leather apron on and his hammer resting head down on the anvil behind him, and the light from his forge threw an orange edge along one side of his face. He did not smile. He tilted his head once slightly toward the interior of the shop. She finished the strap she was tying. She crossed the street. Inside the smithy, the air was thick with the good iron smell of the forge and the sweeter one of cold horse from the mare tied in the corner, waiting to be shod. Josiah closed the door behind her only halfway, so as not to invite talk, and he poured a tin cup of coffee off the pot he kept on a stone shelf at the back of the fire, and he pressed it into her hands without asking. His voice was slow, careful, the voice of a man who had learned decades earlier not to spend more words than a moment required. "I saw him name that price at you." She held the cup with both hands and let the heat come up into her fingers. She did not speak. "He named it because you were alone. He named it because he could. There are men in this town who will do the same. Not all of them, but enough." She looked up. "I know it, Mr. Wetherall. I know you know it." He turned to the forge and adjusted a piece of iron in the coals with a long tong, and while he worked, he spoke to the fire as much as to her. "I told you at the burying I had things to say to you I could not say that day. I have been waiting to see if you would come. I did not know if you would. Some don't." She lowered the cup. "I meant to come. I did not know what I meant to ask." He looked at her sideways. "Ask something." She thought a moment. She heard inside her head the small, clean click the ledger made when a question found the right shape, and she asked it. "Mr. Wetherall, your forge holds its heat a long time after the fire dies. I have seen it. I have felt the walls. How long and by what means, and can it be built into a house?" He set the tong down. He turned fully to face her, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted as if a load he had been carrying for a long time had asked him to put it down. When he spoke, his voice had a new register in it, older further back. "It holds a full night if it is banked right, sometimes into the second morning. The stones do it, dense stone, heavy, fitted tight, not the soft yellow rock, the dark rock granite, or the black rock the river cuts basalt if you can find it. Thick. My forge floor is 18 inches. My back wall is a foot. The stones drink the heat all day, and they give it back all night, and they do not care that the fire is out. They remember it." He paused. His hand rested on the anvil. My father was a smith in Georgia before the war. Not a free one. He built a hearth in the quarters he could tend at night out of stones he carried up from a creek bed one by one over a year of Sundays. That hearth held its heat till dawn, while the great house up the hill let its fires go and shivered. He used to say the stone in the quarters remembered the fire better than the marble in the parlor did. He meant more than one thing by it. She had set the cup down without knowing she had. She was staring at him. He turned to a low shelf under his bench and pulled out a small, leather-bound book no bigger than a woman's hand cracked along the spine and rebound with twine. He weighed it in his palm a moment before he offered it. This was his. He drew what he built. I could never build a house on his diagrams. My work was small work hinges and hooks, and I did not have his patience. You have a patience I recognize, ma'am. Take the book if it helps you toward whatever question your husband left you. Then my father's hands did not stop when they buried him. She did not reach for it right away. Her hand was not steady. When she took the book, she took it with both hands, and she held it against her chest a moment before she slid it inside her coat next to the ledger, and her voice when it came was quieter than she had meant it to be. Mr. Wetherall, I will bring it back to you. He shook his head once. You will not. You will keep it, and you will use it, and one day you will pass it along to whoever comes after you the way I passed it to you. That is what the book is for. She rode home in the last of the afternoon light with 2 books against her ribs and a mule loaded with nails and shakes, and by the time the sorrel topped the pass into Stonebrook Hollow, the sun was gone, and the first pale stars were pricking through above the eastern ridge. She did not stop at the Tebow place. She did not want to talk to Ruth again that day. She wanted the ledger under a lamp. In the cabin, she lit the lamp and set the 2 books on the table side by side, hers and Josiah's father's, and she opened the older one first with the care she would have used on a wounded animal. The pages inside were brown at the edges and covered in a hand not much like hers, but recognizable to her small, careful patient. Diagrams of hearths, cross-sections of a firebox with a chimney flue drawn to scale, notes in a workmanlike shorthand, a section on the fitting of stones without mortar, a phrase underlined twice at the top of one page. Stone that is fitted tight remembers longer than stone that is packed with mud. She read for 2 hours without moving. She forgot the fire. She had to get up once and feed it because the cabin had begun to cool, and she could feel the cold sliding across the packed dirt floor toward her feet, and even that annoyance, that reminder of what the house did to her every night, felt now like fuel. She sat back down. She opened her own ledger to a fresh page. She began to draw. She drew first the outline of a cabin 20 by 16 seen from the side, the way a bird flying past would see it if the wall were gone. She drew below the level of the floor a bed of stones set into a trench, thick, heavy, fitted tight, no less than 18 inches high, running the whole perimeter. She drew above the stones a layer of some other material, something loose and dry, something that would trap air, something whose exact composition she did not yet know, but which she suspected she had already met without knowing it. She drew above that layer a joist system, thick logs running the short way of the cabin 16 inches apart, notched into the stone below. She drew above the joists a wooden floor of milled plank, thick, tight, sealed at the walls. She drew at the top of the wall the hearth in the north wall, the same as any other cabin in the valley, but standing now on this hidden apparatus so that the fire in the firebox would heat not only the air above, but the stones below, and the stones would drink the heat all day, and the loose middle layer would keep the heat from bleeding down into the frozen earth, and the plank above would give the heat back through the soles of a person's feet all night, without anyone waking to feed anything. 3 layers, stone to hold, middle to trap, wood to give, She stared at the drawing a long time. She wrote beside it in small letters 3 words she had not planned to write: Ephraim's design. Then she wrote in even smaller letters underneath those a sentence she meant only for herself, because he had nowhere warm to sit down. She did not weep. She had done that already. She closed both books. She blew out the lamp. She sat in the dark by the hearth a long time, listening to the small, settling sounds of the coals, and she thought about the shape of what she meant to build, and about how long it would take, and about the fact that she was one woman, and it was March, and the ground would not fully give up its frost until May, and about the fact that she did not care, and that she was going to do it anyway. The one problem she had not yet solved was the middle layer. She thought about earth and rejected it because earth packed hard around joists would grow damp and rot the wood. She thought about straw and rejected it because mice would take it in a season. She thought about wool and could not afford enough of it to line a shoebox. She was still turning it over the following week when she rode down to Wendell Prouter's sawmill at Blackthorn Ford to place an order for the plank she would need for the floor, and it was there in the yard behind Prater's mill that the last piece of the middle layer found her without her having to look for it. The mill had come back to life with the thaw. The water wheel turned slow and steady on the swollen creek, and inside the shed the vertical blade moved up and down through a pine log in the deliberate way that made every man who had ever stood beside such a machine take a step back on instinct. Wendell Prater came out of the office to meet her, a thin, sandy-haired man from Ohio, with sawdust in the seams of his shirt and a tally book in his hip pocket, and he took her order for planks, 2 inches by 8 milled, straight, dense pine 40 of them, without commenting on the woman standing in front of him at all. He named her a price that was the same price he had named to Amos Tebow the summer before for a smaller order. He wrote it down in the tally book. He walked her out into the yard to show her the drying stacks she could pick from. The yard behind the mill was a long open space with piles of waste along one edge. The nearest pile was a hip-high mound of sawdust and shavings that had been building since the mill reopened. Odessa saw the pile. She saw above the pile in the cold March air a faint, continuous exhalation of steam no thicker than the breath of a resting horse, but unmistakable. She stopped in the middle of the yard. She looked at Wendell Prater. Her voice was even. She did not want to seem odd to a man who had just given her a fair price. "Mr. Prater, your pile is steaming." He glanced at it. He shrugged. "It does that. I don't know why. All winter it does that. In the middle of the pile, if you dig in, it's warm. Even in January. My boy fell asleep against it once when he was 8, and I about took his ear off. I thought he'd freeze on the outside of a pile that was hot on the inside. He didn't. May I?" She was already walking. He followed. She knelt at the base of the pile and pushed her bare hand into the sawdust. 6 inches in the material was cool to the touch. A foot in it was room temperature. 18 inches in deep enough that she had to lean her shoulder to reach the sawdust was warm. Warm enough that she felt her fingers begin to sweat inside the wool of her sleeve. She pulled her hand out and looked at the fine yellow dust clinging to her wrist. She looked up at Wendell Prater. He was watching her with his head tilted a little to one side, the way a man watches a horse that has done something unexpected, but not dangerous. Her voice was so level she surprised herself. "Mr. Prater, what do you do with this pile at the end of the season?" "Haul it away. Burn it sometimes if it's got too big. Mostly haul it." "Would you sell it?" He laughed once, not unkindly. "Sell my sweepings. Ma'am, I would give you every last ounce for the trouble of carting it off. It attracts nothing worse than mice, and it saves me a wagon. If you want the pile, you can have the pile." She stood up. She brushed the sawdust off her palms. She did not smile because smiling in front of a mill owner over a mound of shavings would have marked her, and she could not afford to be marked. But something inside her chest had, for the first time since the bearing, moved forward instead of down. She had her middle layer. She would not have to guess at it. It was standing in front of her waist high, warm at its heart, free for the hauling. She said only, "I will need a great deal of it, Mr. Prater. I will send word." He tipped his hat. "I'll be here." That night back at the cabin, she wrote out the plan in full for the first time. Not as a sketch, as a plan with quantities. Stone 3 tons from the outcropping a mile northwest, hauled by mule on a travois built for the purpose over the 6 weeks between full thaw and the first hay cutting. Sawdust and shavings 1 wagon load every 10 days from Prater's yard mixed with pine needles gathered from the north slope where the duff was deepest and with crushed charcoal from her own hearth to discourage damp and mice. Joists, 14 of them, cut from the straight pines standing along the creek, debarked and squared by draw knife 1 to 2 per week through July. Plank 40 pieces from Prater dried and delivered by the first week of September. Chinking and oakum already bought. Nails already bought. Time. Time, she wrote, and then she underlined the word once, was the material she had the least of and could not buy. The ground would not accept a spade before the middle of April. The first hard snow could come by the end of October. Between those 2 dates, she had 6 months in which to move roughly 6 tons of material by hand or by mule to open a trench 2 feet deep around a rectangle 16 by 20, to lay the stone perimeter as high as her hip to fill the enclosed cavity with the mixed insulation to a level just below the joists, to set the 14 joists across on their stone bearings and pin them, to lay the plank floor with square nails driven 3 to each crossing, to build the log walls of the cabin around and above this apparatus, to raise the ridgepole, to shake the roof, to hang the door, to build the hearth of the same dense stone the foundation used, and to have a fire lit into her new building before the 2nd week of November. She would need every one of those days. She would need her health and the sorrels and the mules, and she would need to keep enough of a trap line going through the spring to keep the household in coffee, salt, and lead. She would need to eat. She would need to sleep, though not much. She sat back from the ledger. Her hand ached where she had been gripping the pencil. Outside, the wind had turned east and softer, and somewhere down along the creek, an owl was working. She thought about the shape of what she was about to do, and she thought about how it would look to Amos Tebow, and how it would look to Ruth, and how it would look to Bebe if word ever got as far as Blackthorn Ford, which it would, because in that country everything eventually did. She thought about the woman she had been in October, who would have laughed at a woman doing this. She thought about the woman she was now. Then she wrote near the bottom of the page 3 sentences she would come back to often in the months ahead, when the mule went lame, or the stone would not fit, or her back gave out on her in the middle of the trench and she had to lie flat in the dirt for an hour before she could stand. She had not built a house before. She had watched a house being built. She had loved a man who built houses. That was, she decided, enough to begin. April came late. The last hard frost held into the 2nd week, and the ground did not truly break until the 17th, when she went out at first light with the pick and the shovel Ephraim had left in the shed, and drove the pick into the earth at the corner of her marked-out rectangle, and felt at last the point sink in. She had chosen a site half a mile from the old cabin on the low rise that Ephraim had once pointed to and said would catch a breeze in July with clear drainage down toward the creek and a stand of young pine at its back to break the north wind. The site was hers because Ephraim had once said out loud that he liked it, and she had written that down, and she could find in the ledger from July of '80 the exact page where his sentence lived. She dug alone for 4 days before Amos Tebow rode up to see what she was doing. He sat the mule at the edge of the site and watched her without dismounting for a full 5 minutes while she threw shovelfuls of clay onto a growing berm. She did not stop working. She did not look up. Eventually, he cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was flat, not unfriendly, honestly puzzled. "Mrs. Ridgway, that is a foundation trench like I have never seen. Are you building a house or burying an ox?" She did straighten then. She wiped her forehead on the back of her sleeve. She met his eyes. Her tone was even and short, no invitation in it. "Building a house, Mr. Tebow, it doesn't need to be that deep." "This one does." He looked a while longer. He shook his head slowly and turned the mule. "Ruth said to bring you these." He handed down a small cloth bundle. It contained 3 biscuits, still warm, wrapped around a piece of ham. She took it. She did not thank him aloud. She only nodded once. He rode off. She sat on the berm and ate one of the biscuits standing up, and she resumed digging before the last crumb was out of her mouth. She dug for the whole of April and the first 2 weeks of May. She widened the trench to 18 inches. She squared the corners. She graded the bottom to level with a length of oiled twine and a small wooden bob. When she was finished, she had moved by her own count more than 6,000 pounds of Dakota earth by herself, and her hands had grown a callus across the palms that was so thick she could set them on the stove without flinching. She hauled stone through the last week of May and the whole of June. She rode out at dawn to the granite outcropping northwest of the hollow and levered slabs down the slope with a pry bar Ephraim had made from a wagon spring. She lashed them to the travois. She walked beside the mule on the way back because a lame mule in June would have finished her. She did this 5 days a week. On the 6th day, she trapped what she could still take in the warm weather, and on the 7th, she rested, which is to say she washed her clothes and read the Bible and slept. In late June, at the end of one such day, Amos rode past again with his oldest boy on a second mule behind him, and this time he stopped at the edge of the site, and this time he did not smile, and this time the boy did. The boy was 12. He had his mother's mouth and his father's tendency to say what should not be said, and he laughed once at what he saw, and he asked in the loud, clear voice of a child, "But what's she making?" Amos looked at the trench, which now had its first course of stone laid along the north and east sides. He looked at Odessa standing in it with dirt on her cheek and her sleeves rolled and her hair tied back with a strip of gingham. He looked at his son. He said loud enough for her to hear and slow enough that the boy would not miss it. "Son, look sharp. This is how a person does not build a cabin. Woman alone gets ideas." The boy laughed again. Amos did not. He touched his hat brim to Odessa in a way that might have been apology and might have been condescension and rode on. She stood in the trench with the trowel in her hand a long moment after they were gone. She did not throw it. She set it down. She climbed out of the trench. She went to the cabin. She opened the ledger and she wrote in the same small hand she had used for everything else the sentence she had been carrying since she was 9 years old. And a man in an Elizabeth City store had refused to sell her mother thread. They laughed. Ephraim would have understood. He always did. Then she went back out to the trench and she laid 3 more stones before dark because grief was long and stones were finite. In July, the stone walls rose to the height of her knee. In August, they reached her hip. She fitted each stone the way Josiah's father had drawn in the little brown book, tight against its neighbor's minimal clay, in the gaps relying on flat surface and honest weight. She rejected the soft yellow rock. She kept the granite and the darker basalt she could find in the creek bed. She was building without knowing the word of Mass, and she felt it in her arms every night when she lay in bed unable to sleep from the ache. In early September, the joist began. She cut the pine along the creek herself, one at a time, dropping them with a felling axe Ephraim had kept sharp enough to shave with. She debarked each log with a draw knife on a pair of trestles she had made from cottonwood scraps. She squared the bearing surfaces where each joist would meet its stone. She notched them. She set them one after another across the trench, 16 inches apart, pinned into the stone, with wooden pegs driven through holes she drilled by hand, with an auger whose handle wore a fresh blister on the crook of her thumb every day for a week. When the joists were in and the fill was ready to go, she stood in the middle of the empty raised platform at the end of a day in the middle of September, and she looked out at the west ridge in the failing gold light, and she thought about how much lumber she still needed and how little coin she still had, and she went inside the old cabin, and she opened the small carved box on the shelf above the door, where Ephraim had kept the two things he had considered heirlooms: his father's pocket knife, his mother's gold locket on a chain oval engraved with a laurel branch holding no picture inside because his mother had never sat for one. She took the locket in her palm. She held it a long time. She had promised Ephraim on the porch in Nicodemus the week they were married that she would never sell it, and she had meant it, and Ephraim, if he had known what she meant to trade it for, would have laughed his low tenor laugh and pulled it off the chain himself. She rode down to Blackthorn Ford the next morning at first light. She did not go to Beebe's. She went to the small back office of a jeweler who came through once a season from Yankton, and she caught him on his last day before he left for the winter, and she stood in his lamplight with the locket between them on a scrap of black velvet, and she watched his glass go over it, and she watched him weigh it, and she watched him count out coin that would not have bought a good milk cow in Nicodemus, but would exactly cover the balance of Prater's plank order and a keg of nails besides. She folded the receipt of sale. She slid it into the back cover of the ledger. She rode home. She did not stop at the Tebow place. That night at the table, in a hand that did not shake, she wrote a single sentence in the ledger beside the pasted receipt, and it was the truest sentence she had written since the winter. He would have said yes. That would have to be enough. In the last week of September, Wendell Prater's oldest hand delivered the 40 planks to her yard on a heavy wagon and would not accept a coin for the delivery, only a nod and a promise that Prater would hear she had received them. Josiah Wetherell arrived at her gate on horseback on the 2nd of October with a bedroll behind his saddle and a canvas bag of chisels and pegs across the pommel, and he did not ask permission to stay. He only tied his mare and stood beside Odessa at the edge of the raised platform and looked at what she had done and looked at her and nodded once slowly the way he had nodded at the graveside. His voice was steady, unhurried, meant only for her. I have wanted to see this work with my own eyes. I have 4 days I can spend before the smithy calls me back. If you'll have an old man's hands, I will lay stone with you until the fill goes in. She had not until that moment allowed herself to admit she needed help. She admitted it now silently, with a slight lowering of her chin, and Josiah understood and did not require her to say a word. For the next 4 days, the two of them worked in a rhythm that neither of them named. He tapped each stone with the flat of his hammer and listened and set aside the ones whose note was hollow and kept the ones that rang low. She learned from watching him choose more about stone in 4 days than she had learned in 4 months. On the last eve, standing sitting on the top course of the north wall with the sunset behind them, he told her without turning his head a thing he had not told anyone in years. My father did not live to see a house of his own. He died on a place that was not his. He built that hearth in the quarters and warmed his children on it, and he never got to warm his own bones on a stone he had chosen. I am telling you this so you understand that some hands finish work that other hands began. Yours are finishing his. She could not speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice was low, careful the way she had learned to keep it in front of Bibi. "Then he is here, Mr. Wetherall." Josiah did not answer. He put a hand on her shoulder briefly and took it away. Ruth Tebow came by twice in October once with a bolt of unbleached muslin she claimed she had no use for, and once with 2 loaves of bread. She did not offer either time to work. She stood at the edge of the yard, watched a while, and rode home. On her second visit as she was leaving, she paused with the mule half turned and spoke over her shoulder without meeting Odessa's eye. Her tone was even, and the words dropped out of her like stones set down carefully in a stream. "Mrs. Ridgway, I do not understand a word of what you are doing, but I have seen a woman work like that once before in my life, and she was my grandmother, and she was right." She rode. Odessa did not answer. She only stood in the yard with a hammer in her hand and watched Ruth's back until the mule was out of sight. In late October, the fill went in. She and Wendell Prater's hand made 3 trips together in the wagon, and she mixed the sawdust with pine needles she had gathered by the sackful all summer, and with crushed charcoal from a barrel behind the old cabin, in the proportion she had arrived at by trial with small boxes on the floor of the front room. She spread the mixture between the joists in slow, careful passes, packing it just firm enough to stay, and no firmer because the air between the particles was the whole point. When the fill reached the underside of the joist, she stopped and she brushed her hands off. And she stood in the middle of what would be her floor and looked down between the joists at the pale dry sea she had made. On the 21st of November, she laid the last plank on the floor, drove the last nail, and set the door in its frame with the shims she had cut and planed the week before. The cabin was not yet a cabin. The walls were up but rough, the chinking was not sealed. The hearthstones were laid but had not held a fire. There was no glass in the window and would not be. But the floor was down. That night in the almost cabin, with the wind stirring, but not yet biting through the unchinked gaps, she lay down on the plank on her back, with her ear pressed to the wood, and she spoke to it in a voice no one but the wood could have heard. And the ledger on the packing crate that would be her table was closed and stacked on top of the little brown book of Josiah's father, and she said the words that had been assembling themselves in her mouth for 11 months. "If you had had somewhere like this to sit down that night, you would have come home." She did not weep. She lay on the warm wood and let her breath even out, and thought about the fire she would lay in the morning, and about how the stones would begin at last to remember it. On the 22nd of November, she built the first fire. She built it small at the start, the way Josiah's father's book instructed, and she fed it larger through the afternoon. And by dusk, the interior of the cabin held a steady heat she could feel on the front of her body when she stood by the hearth. She walked the room every quarter hour with her palm to the floor. At first, the plank felt only neutral. By evening, it felt warm. By 10 o'clock, she could stand on it in her stocking feet without wanting to move. She let the fire die at midnight. She wrapped herself in a single blanket and lay down. She woke at 3 in the morning to a cabin whose air had dropped, yes, but whose floor was still faintly, unbelievably warmer than her hand. She sat up. She pressed her palm flat to the plank beside the bed. She could feel it. She could feel the heat coming up out of the wood, thin as a whisper, steady as a pulse. She did not shout. She did not smile. She only lay back down and put her ear once again to the plank, and this time alone in a house that no one else in Stonebrook Hollow yet believed in. She began quietly in the dark to laugh because the country had spent 11 months telling her a thing, and she had finally told it back. In the last week of November, riding up from Blackthorn Ford with a sack of coffee across the pommel, Amos Tebow stopped at her gate and gave her, without dismounting, the piece of news Wendell Prater had asked him to pass along. His face was drawn. His voice was low. "Prater says a front is coming down out of the north. He heard it from a rider up out of Bismarck. Worst cold in a decade, they think." maybe 2. Get your wood in Mrs. Ridgway. This one is going to bite. She thanked him. She did not tell him what she had built. She did not need to. She stood at the gate and watched him ride away, and she thought about the stones under her floor, and the mixed pale sea between her joists, and the plank under her heels, and she thought without triumph, without fear, in the plain private voice she used only for the ledger that Stonebrook Hollow was at last about to ask her a question she had prepared an answer for. The front came down on the 18th of December in the way a great animal comes down out of high country without hurry, without warning, without any of the theater the smaller storms of that year had used. The barometer in Wendell Prater's office in Blackthorn Ford dropped a full inch between sunrise and noon, and by 3 in the afternoon the sky over Stonebrook Hollow had gone the flat, blue-white color of skimmed milk. The color the old trappers said meant that the air itself had run out of moisture to give and would begin now to take. The wind that came with the cold was not loud. That was the thing everyone would remember about that week. It moved past the eaves of the cabins in the valley with a small, dry hiss that a person had to stop breathing to hear, and it carried inside of it a temperature that made the ordinary Dakota winter feel in retrospect like a soft season. At noon of the 18th, the thermometer nailed to the shady side of the Tebow barn read -22. At midnight, it read -44. On the morning of the 19th, it read -51 before Ruth Tebow stopped going out to look at it because a person who put her face against that glass for more than 3 seconds risked the skin of her forehead. In the Tebow cabin, the family made the arrangements every family in the valley was making. Amos rose at midnight to feed the stove. Ruth rose at 4 to relieve him. The 3 children slept in a nest of every blanket the house owned, laid out on the floor within 4 feet of the hearth, and the eldest boy, the same boy who had laughed in June at the woman digging in her trench, was made to keep his boots on inside the house for the first time in his life because his mother had felt his toes at 11 and had not liked what she felt. Amos burned through half the woodpile in 3 days. He would tell people later that he could feel the cold coming down the chimney at him whenever the flames slackened, as if the sky itself were trying to reach in and take back the heat he had bought from it. 2 miles south, in a cabin owned by a widower named Cyrus Halliday, whose wife had died in childbed the summer before the man overslept the 2-hour cycle he had set for himself, and woke at 4 in the morning to a fire that was down to 3 coals and a set of fingers he could no longer close into a fist. He lit the fire again by dropping the match with both hands together, one shaking too badly to steady the other. And when the flame took, he sat on the floor beside it and put his hands palms up into the ash at the mouth of the firebox, and he wept in a way that a man of that country did not weep except when he was alone and had understood that he had almost gone. He did not tell anyone for a week. When he did, he told Josiah Wetherell, because Josiah was the only man in Blackthorn Ford who had ever listened to him without turning it into a story. In the cabin on the rise above Stonebrook Hollow, Odessa Ridgway went about the 18th and 19th and 20th, in a way her nearest neighbor would not have recognized if he had been able to see through her walls. She built her fire large in the morning and let it burn strong through the daylight hours, feeding it steadily, but without the frantic feeding the country was doing in every other house in the valley. At the last of the light on the 18th, when the mercury outside her window had begun its long slide toward the number no one in the hollow would forget, she loaded the firebox one final time with 2 split lengths of green pine on top of a bed of oak coals, and she watched the flames take, and she banked them low, and she went to bed. She did not rise at midnight. She did not rise at 4. She slept for the first time in a Dakota December in her whole life, straight through from 10 to 5. And when she woke, it was to a cabin whose air made her breath visible and whose plank floor, under her stocking feet as she swung her legs down from the bunk, felt not warm exactly, but warm enough that she did not gasp when she stood. She lit a candle. She stirred the ash. She found under the top layer of white a bed of coals still faintly red at the heart, and she coaxed a fire back out of them without needing so much as a shaving of kindling. And by the time the sky over the east ridge had gone from black to the color of wet iron, her front room was climbing back towards 60 degrees. She opened the ledger. She wrote in the same small, careful hand she had used for 18 months 4 numbers and 1 sentence. Fire bank 10 p.m. Air 5 a.m. 39 degrees. Floor at bunk 52. Coals viable without kindling. The stones remember. She underlined nothing. On the morning of the 23rd of December, the 5th day of the cold, Ruth Thibault, who had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the front had come down, put down her coffee cup on the kitchen table and told her husband to ride up the pass and see whether Mrs. Ridgway was still alive. Amos did not argue. He had been meaning to go himself since the second day, and had not because the ride was long and the cold was killing, and because he had not, in truth, wanted to be the man who found her. He saddled the mule at first light. The animal did not want to leave the barn. He rode out anyway, wrapped in the buffalo coat his father had brought out of Missouri in '64, with a wool scarf pulled up to his eyes, and his beard already white with the frost of his own breath, before he had reached the end of his own yard. He came up the pass with the sun barely a hand above the ridge. The whole of Stonebrook Hollow lay below him, blue-shadowed and blue-lit, the smoke from 4 of the 7 cabins in the valley rising in thin vertical plumes that broke apart 40 feet above the roofs and hung there unmoving. He counted the plumes, he counted them again. He rode toward the 7th cabin, the one on the rise half a mile past the crooked cottonwood, and as he came within the last quarter-mile of it, he understood that his count had not been wrong. Odessa Ridgway's chimney was cold. There was no smoke. There was no shimmer of heat above the mud-caulked brick. He put his heels to the mule. He had a bad taste in his mouth. He was without permitting himself to think it already choosing the words he would carry back down to Ruth and Reverend McCabe. The words a man had to have ready in that country, because the country did not give a man time to compose them at the moment they were needed. He came into her yard at a canter that the mule protested. He swung down. He crossed the porch in 2 strides. He raised his gloved fist. Before he could bring it down on the door opened, and Odessa Ridgway stood in her own doorway, in a plain wool shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearm, and no coat on and no hat on, and the kettle in her left hand, and she looked at him with an expression he could not read at first, because it was an expression his face had not seen on a woman in that valley before, which was the expression of a person for whom the temperature outside had ceased to be a matter of survival. She stepped back. She did not say his name. Her voice was low, mild, the voice of a woman receiving an expected guest. "Come in, Mr. Thibault. Close the door behind you." He came in. He closed the door. He stood inside her front room with the buffalo coat still buttoned to his chin and his scarf still bunched around his beard, and he felt at first only the ordinary shock of any warm room after a long ride in that cold, and he began automatically to shrug the coat off his shoulders. He got the coat halfway down his arms before he stopped. He stopped because he had looked up and had taken in the room and had understood, in the way a man understands a thing his mouth is not yet permitted to say, that the room he was standing in was not warm, the way a room with a fire is warm. It was warm the way a room ought to be warm when a fire has been burning in it steadily for the past 24 hours, and there was no fire in it. There had not been a fire in it, he could see at a glance, for at least 6 hours. The hearth in the north wall held nothing but a low bed of white ash, and at its center one dull red bead the size of a pea. His breath fogged only faintly. Under his boots through the leather he could feel it. He looked down. He looked up at her. His mouth worked without a word coming out of it. She set the kettle down on the trivet at the corner of the hearth. Her tone remained level. She did not smile. "Take your coat off, Mr. Tebow. Sit down. I will make us coffee. You have questions." He got the coat off. He did not remember later hanging it on the peg. He sat on the pine bench at her table, which she had made herself out of the offcuts from Prater's mill, and he watched her measure out coffee grounds into her small tin pot with hands that were not, he noticed with a small, dry shock, hands that had spent the last 5 days shaking. He was aware in the middle of his own confusion of the ache in his own fingers and of the fact that the ache was fading in a room where no fire burned. He said the only sentence he had in his head. "Ma'am, your stove is out." "Yes, it has been out since about midnight." He looked at her. She poured hot water off her second kettle, which she kept on the coals of the small cook fire she had lit in the hearth an hour before he arrived, and she set the coffee pot on the trivet to steep. She sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the tabletop. She waited. He said the second sentence he had. "How?" She let a small breath out through her nose. She looked past him briefly at the window on the west wall and then back at him, and her voice did not rise. "Do you remember the trench, Mr. Tebow?" He remembered the trench. He had ridden past it a dozen times through the spring and summer, and he had in June in front of his oldest boy said what he had said. He nodded once. "There is stone in that trench, 3 tons of it, set 18 inches thick, running the whole perimeter of this cabin from a foot below ground level to 18 inches above. Granite mostly, some basalt where the creek gave me a good piece, fitted tight, almost no mortar. Above that, between the stones and the floor, you are sitting over there as a filling, sawdust mostly from Prater's yard, pine needles from the north slope, charcoal from my old hearth, 2 feet deep, ab above the filling joist 16 inches on center, the joist's plank." She stopped. She let him look at her. "The fire burns during the day. The stones drink the heat. The filling keeps the heat from going down into the ground. The plank gives the heat back up through the floor all night. The fire does not have to burn. The stones do the burning for it. They remember what the fire told them." He did not answer. He put his hand palm flat on the tabletop, which was pine and no warmer than any tabletop. And then without asking, he slid off the bench and knelt on her floor and pressed his bare palm to the plank between his knees. He held it there. He held it there until his hand had adjusted and until he could tell the difference between the temperature of his own palm and the temperature of the wood, and then he understood and something in his throat closed. He looked up at her from the floor. He had, in the moment he pressed his palm to the plank, forgotten to be a Missouri man and remembered to be an honest one. His voice came out of him rough. "Woman, if Ephraim had had a place like this to sit down in that broken country, he would have walked home." She looked at him a long moment. She did not correct him. She did not soften it. What she said when she said it was the sentence she had been carrying in her mouth for 11 months, waiting for a person to earn the right to hear it, and Amos Tebow had, kneeling on her floor with his own palm on her plank, earned it. "No, Mr. Tebow, this did not save Ephraim. It cannot save him now. It can save the next one." He did not stand up right away. He sat back on his heels on her floor, and he looked at the low ash in the hearth and at the plank and at the woman on the pine bench, and he thought about the boy he had raised to laugh and about the sentence he had said in front of that boy in June and about the fact that Ruth had told him once 10 years back that a man's mouth was a horse. A man had to keep bridled or it would carry him places he did not intend to go. He got up slowly. He drank the coffee she poured him. He stayed almost an hour without speaking again, beyond common courtesies. When he stood to leave, he stood in her doorway a long moment, with his coat over his arm, and he said without looking at her one thing more, "Ma'am, may I bring Ruth up tomorrow? Just to see it, just to stand in the room. Bring her, Mr. Tebow. Bring her whenever she will come." He rode home. When Ruth met him at the door of the Tebow Dakota, she took one look at his face and did not ask him what he had found. She only said quietly, her voice pitched under the noise of the children, "Was she alive?" He answered, and it was not the answer she had been braced for, because the answer had two parts, and the second part was the one that mattered. She was alive, and her floor was warm in a house with no fire. Ruth did not speak for a long time. She turned away and put water on for coffee. Her back was very straight. She said over her shoulder in a tone that a man who had been married to her for 15 years knew how to read, "Then tomorrow we go." Word did not wait for Amos to carry it. It moved on its own the way news moved in that country, through the small chores that took a neighbor onto another neighbor's porch, through the mule that carried a borrowed pot back to a kitchen with a piece of gossip in the empty bottom, through the ride Reverend McCabe made on the 24th from Blackthorn Ford to check on the outlying families. By the 26th, 3 families had come up the pass to Odessa's rise. By New Year's 6, she opened the door to every one of them. She stood in the middle of her front room with her ledger closed on the table behind her, and she showed them the stones she had let show at the base of the north wall, where the plank did not quite meet the wall, and she lifted one of the hinged planks she had made for maintenance and let each of them look down into the pale-warm sea of sawdust and see the stone shining faintly beneath it. And she named the materials by name, and she named the depths by number. She did not offer them tea. She did not offer them anything but the arithmetic. It was not lack of hospitality. It was that she understood before any of them did that what she had was not a house but a design, and that a design given away over tea became a story, and a design given away as arithmetic became a thing a man could build on his own land. Cyrus Halliday, the widower, who had come within a quarter hour of dying alone on the ash-swept floor of his own cabin, rode up on the 2nd of January, and he came alone, and he did not take his hat off when he came in. He was a lean, hard-faced man from Illinois who had never, in the 8 years Odessa had known of him, said a full sentence to a colored person that did not contain the word boy or aunt. And he stood in her front room now with his hat in his hands, and he did not look at her when he spoke. His voice was tight. His breath still came fogged because he had been in her house only 2 minutes, and the cold he had ridden in with had not yet left his lungs. "Who taught you this?" She looked at him. She did not move. She had, in the 10 days since Amos Tebow had knelt on her floor, been asked this question in some form by every man who had come through her door, though never so bluntly. Ruth had asked it with her eyes. Reverend McCabe had asked it as if he already knew the answer and only wanted to hear her say it. Amos had not asked at all, which was in its way a form of asking. Halliday was the first to ask it aloud, and the reason he asked it aloud, she understood without any effort at all, was that he was the first who could not bear the answer she had. She let him wait a moment before she gave it to him. When she spoke the way she had spoken to Bibi over the counter in Blackthorn Ford, which was slowly and clearly, and with the small, measured weight of a woman who had counted her own coin onto a plank and did not need his approval to spend it. "My husband left me a question, Mr. Halliday. Mr. Wetherall left me a book his father drew. The ground taught me the rest. There was no white man in the room." He looked at her then. His face did a thing she had watched other faces do, a small tightening across the jaw that was not quite anger and not quite shame, and was in fact the exact place where anger and shame met, and made a third thing that did not have a name in the language of Stonebrook Hollow. He put his hat back on. He walked once around the room, looking at the plank, at the hearth, at the small door she had cut into the wall behind the stove for the cleaning of the flue. He did not touch anything. He came back to her, and he did not thank her, but he did not have to. She had not built the cabin for his thanks. He asked her in a voice that was almost his own again, "How long does it take to build if a man had help?" Half a year if he starts at the thaw and does nothing else. 4 months if 2 men work it and a woman keeps them fed. And the stone, granite, basalt if you can get it, no soft rock. Weigh it with a hammer. If it rings low, it holds heat. If it rings high, it doesn't. He nodded. He walked to the door. He paused there with his hand on the latch, and he turned his head, and he said, without meeting her eye, the closest thing to a concession she would ever hear out of Cyrus Halliday. "Ma'am, I will build one in the spring." She let him go. She did not answer. She closed the door after he was on his mule, and she stood a long moment with her hand on the latch, and she did not smile because she had learned already that in that country the smile came only after the thing was truly done, and it was not truly done yet. She only opened the ledger and she wrote his name and the date, and in the column she had begun to keep that week one word: for you. Building. Josiah Wetherall came up the pass in the second week of January, having ridden the 40 miles from Blackthorn Ford in 2 days because he would not push his mare in that cold. He arrived in the last of the forenoon light, and he tied his horse at Odessa's gate, and he came up the porch steps without hurry, and he did not knock because Odessa had at the first sound of hooves opened the door for him. He came in. He did not speak. He did the same thing Amos had done. He set his hand on the plank floor, though he did it standing up, and he stood there a full minute with his palm to the wood and his eyes closed. And then he opened his eyes and he looked around the room and he took off his hat. He did not sit for a long time. He walked the room the way an old smith walks a horse he has been sent to appraise, running his hand once along the mantel, tapping the stone at the base of the wall with his knuckle, and listening to the note it made, laying his palm flat against the north-facing log, and feeling the coldness that ought to have been there, and finding instead a wall that had drunk from the fire the day before and had not yet finished giving the heat back. He did not, until he had done all of this, permit himself to speak. When he did, he sat down at her table, and he laid his hat on the bench beside him, and he folded his old hands together on the wood, and he did not look at her face. He looked at his hands. His voice was quiet and slow and had the sound in it of a man who had waited a long time to say what he was about to say. "My father tried, ma'am. He tried in a shed in Georgia in 1843 to teach 3 young men what he knew about stone. 2 of them were sold before he finished. The third was killed by a mule, if it was a mule, in 1849. He never got to finish teaching. He wrote what he could in the little book I gave you, and he died believing the knowledge died with him." He stopped. He looked up. His eyes were dry. "It did not die with him." She could not speak. He put his palm briefly on the back of her hand where it rested on the table, and he took it away. And he sat with her a while, and he drank the coffee she poured him, and eventually he cleared his throat, and he said the last thing he had come to say. "You did not do this alone, cousin. My father is in this floor. Your husband is in this floor. The ground you dug is in this floor. Say that when they ask you. Say all of it. Do not let them take a single name out of it. Not his, not my father's, not yours." She nodded. She was at last permitting herself something she had not permitted since the burying, which was to let another person see briefly that her eyes were wet. He drank his coffee. He did not look at her while it passed. In the last week of January, when the front finally lifted off the northern plains and the thermometer at the Tebow barn climbed back into the single digits below zero, which fell to every family in the valley like a warm spring day. 3 men from 3 different farms came to Odessa within a single week and asked her to draw them what she had built. She drew for them patiently on scraps of paper she had begun to keep on the table for the purpose. And she drew the same drawing 3 times, and she did not shorten it or hurry it for any of the 3. And she took from each of them and trade nothing but a single promise. The promise was small and specific, and she did not bargain over its wording. Each man who built a cabin on her design was to carve into the underside of one of the plank boards of his floor. Before the plank was nailed 2 letters and a date, ER 1881. The men agreed. She did not ride out to their farms to check. She did not need to. In the country of Stonebrook Hollow, a promise made in a woman's front room to a woman with a ledger open on the table between her hands was a promise a man kept or a promise a man did not. And the ones who did not, she understood, were not the ones who mattered. By the end of 1883, 4 cabins in the valley stood on the design she had drawn, and by 1885, 11 spread across 3 counties of the Dakota Territory, and by 1887, more than she was able to count without leaving her chair, because word had traveled the way word traveled on the wagons of settlers moving further west, on the tongues of drovers passing through Blackthorn Ford, on the letters women wrote to their sisters in the East and read aloud at meetings in church basements, and the design had begun without her presence to teach itself. People in that country called it at first the warm floor, which was what it was. Some called it the Ridgeway floor, which was closer to the truth. A handful in the towns to the south called it the widow's floor, meaning her, and she did not correct them because she was and had been and would be. She did not care what any of them called it. She cared only that when a man built one, he cut the 2 letters into the wood before he laid it down. It was in the spring of 1887, when the last snowmelt was still running loud in the creek at the bottom of the hollow, that Odessa Ridgeway sat down at the table she had built with her own hands and wrote in her ledger a decision she had been carrying in her chest for most of a year. She wrote, done what she had come to Dakota to do. The design was no longer hers. It belonged now to the country. She was 38 years old. She had a small stack of coin in a tin box behind the stone at the base of the north wall, and she had a horse and a mule, and she had 2 books, and she had a widow's grief that had thinned over the years into something closer to a companion than a wound. She was not going to grow old alone in a valley where every family had received and taken and built with what she had given, without ever quite forgiving her for having been the one to give it. She sold the cabin on the rise on the 7th of May of that year to a family newly arrived from Nashville, Tennessee. Colored people, husband and wife, and 3 girls under the age of 10, who had heard on the wagon road out of Yankton that a woman near Blackthorn Ford might be selling a house that would not need to be tended in the dark hours. She did not haggle. She named a fair price. She stayed with them 3 days after the sale was signed, and she walked the husband through the maintenance of the hinged planks, and she taught the wife how to bank the fire at 10 and rise at 5. And she stood in the front room with all 5 of them the night before she left, and she said to them the sentence she had rehearsed on the ride down from the rise that afternoon. Her voice was quiet. She did not want them to feel weight. She wanted them to feel welcome. This is a house that will not kill you if you sleep. Sleep in it. That is what it is for. She left in the morning. She rode south. She did not stop at the Tebow place, though she and Ruth had come in the years since the front of '82 to something quieter than friendship and warmer than a truce. Ruth had ridden up to see her the week before, and the 2 women had sat on the porch of the cabin without speaking for most of an hour. And Ruth had at the end of the hour taken Odessa's hand in her own 2 hands and pressed it once and released it and got on her mule and ridden home. That had been their goodbye. She rode to Blackthorn Ford. She stopped at Josiah Weatherall's smithy. She found him at his forge, older, thinner still, capable of setting a shoe on a bad-footed horse in less than 11 minutes. And she stood in the doorway of the shop the way he had once stood in his own doorway to bring her in out of BB Street, and she did not have to speak. He set down the tong. He wiped his hands on his apron. He walked over. He hugged her once briefly without ceremony, the way an uncle hugs a niece who has come home. His voice when it came was calm, unhurried, tuned to the moment. "You going then?" "I am." "Where?" "Portland, Oregon. I heard there's colored folk building a district there. I want to be around people who look like me for a while." He nodded slowly. "That is a fair want, cousin." She took a breath. "Mr. Weatherall, your father's book. I have kept it 8 years. I would like to leave it here, in the town where you brought me the first cup of coffee anyone poured me for free after Ephraim was gone. I would like it to stay where the two of you began teaching me." He shook his head gently. "It is your book, cousin. You take it. When your time comes, you give it to the next one. My father did not draw for one hand only. He drew for the hand after that." She put the book back in her coat against the ledger. She rode. She reached Portland, Oregon in the second week of September of 1887, having come out by rail as far as Ogden and by wagon and river the rest of the way, and she took a room in a boarding house on the edge of what people in that city were beginning to call the Black District. And she found within a month a small storefront on a side street where she could sell dry goods and men clothes, and she made in her first year exactly enough to eat, and in her second enough to set some aside. She married Marcus Freeman, a widowed carpenter with two daughters aged 9 and 11, in the spring of 1891, in a small ceremony at the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church on the corner of 10th and Everett Streets. Marcus had grown up in Baltimore. He built cabinets for the parlors of the city's rising black professionals, and he made stools for their children in his spare time out of the offcuts. And he had, the first time he came into her shop to buy thread, told her a joke about a mule and a preacher that had made her laugh out loud for the first time in 9 years. And she had, when she stopped laughing, understood that she was going to marry him. His daughters were named Bernice and Ada. They called her from the second week Miss Odessa, and by the end of the first year, Mama Odessa, and she never asked them to change it and never told them to. She and Marcus did not have children of their own. She had, in the winter of 1882, in the weeks after the front lifted, understood in the private way a woman understands such things, that the fever that had almost killed her the night Ephraim died had in its passing closed a door in her body she could not open again. She had not grieved that door for long. She had, by the time Bernice put a small hand into hers at the breakfast table in the spring of '91, come to believe that the country had returned to her in a different shape what it had taken. She lived 31 years in Portland. She sewed, she sold thread, she raised the two girls. She saw Bernice married in 1897 to a school teacher from Salem, and Ada married in 1900 to a Pullman porter who worked the run to Chicago and came home once a fortnight with the paper and stories. She had 4 grandchildren, and by 1912, all of them at her table on Christmas of that year. And it was in the following autumn, in November of 1912, that a cough she had first felt in her chest in September deepened into a pneumonia that neither the AME church doctor nor the good white Dr. Marcus paid double for could clear, and she died in her own bed on the 7th of November, 3 days short of her 63rd birthday, with Marcus beside her, holding her right hand, and Bernice on the other side holding her left. She had asked in the last week only one thing of her family, and Marcus had promised. She had asked that her ledger in the small brown book Josiah Weatherall had given her be kept together, and that when the time came, they be given to whichever grandchild seemed most likely to open them. Marcus kept the books in a cedar chest under their bed, for the 16 years he outlived her, and when he died in 1928, Bernice took them into her own house and set them on the shelf beside her mother's family Bible and did not open them for another 30 years. The cabin on the rise above Stonebrook Hollow stood 47 years past the day Odessa closed its door for the last time. The Nashville family who bought it from her lived in it 11 years and sold it in 1898 to a Norwegian couple who came out on the railroad and were told by the school teacher in Blackthorn Ford who handled the sale that the house was warm in a way other houses in the valley were not and did not require the same tending in the small hours. The Norwegians raised 4 sons in it. They sold it in 1921 to a young rancher from Nebraska who kept it as a summer place. He let it go in 1933 to a family who used it through the last hard years of the drought, and then in the fall of 1934 made the decision every family in that valley eventually made, which was that the cabin had grown too small for the size the family had become, and that it was time to pull it down and put up something with a second story and a proper glass window on every wall. They hired 2 men out of Rapid City to do the work. The men came in October. They took the roof off first. They stripped the shakes and the shathing and dropped them in a pile in the yard. They pulled the logs of the walls down one at a time, stacking the good ones for reuse. They came on the 4th day of the work to the floor. The older of the 2 men had built floors in Dakota for 31 years and had until that afternoon never seen one built on stone and a raised foundation over a bed of fill. He got down on his knees on the pried-up planks. He pulled up a second board. He sat back on his heels, and he looked into the cavity below, and he called the younger man over, and the 2 of them stood together at the edge of the exposed frame for a long time without speaking. Then the older man, whose name was John Karsten, went down into the town office in Blackthorn Ford and told the clerk what he had found under the Ridgeway cabin, and the clerk, whose grandmother had once been Ruth Tebow's second cousin, walked down to the schoolhouse and told the school teacher, and the school teacher wrote a letter that same afternoon to a man she knew at the Historical Society in Pierre. The board they pulled out first before they finished the demolition was the 4th plank from the north wall. They pulled it because Karsten had on impulse run his hand along the underside of it, feeling for the marks he had begun to expect after the day's discovery, and he had found the 2 letters and the date cut into the pine with the point of a knife cut deep enough to have survived 53 winters, and cut carefully enough that even now, in the low light of a Dakota afternoon in October of 1934, the shapes were as clear as if they had been made the week before. ER 1881. Karsten showed the plank to the family. The family gave the plank to the Historical Society, and the Historical Society in 1938 placed the plank on a shelf in a small glass case in the corner of the newly opened South Dakota State History Museum in Pierre, with a card beside it that read, in the plain, unromantic script of a curator who had no idea what she had been given, Foundation Board Ridgeway Cabin, Stonebrook Hollow, circa 1881. Function unknown. It stayed there 20 years. In the spring of 1958, a great-granddaughter of Odessa Ridgeway named Louise Freeman, 22 years old in her final year of a history degree at the University of Oregon, went home to Portland for the Easter holiday and asked her grandmother Bernice on a whim whether the family had any papers from the old people. Bernice, who was 83, went into her bedroom and came out with a cedar chest, and she opened the chest and she gave the girl a black ledger and a small brown book and had been rebound in 20, and she said, without weight only, your great-grandmother wrote in one of them. The other one, an old man in Dakota gave her. His father drew the pictures. Louise Freeman read the ledger that summer in the reading room of the Portland Public Library. She read it slowly, 1 page at a time. She read the columns of hearthstone temperatures and the observations about the north wall, and the sentence about mapping for the Lord, and the sentence written in the dark on the night of the burying. and the receipt for a gold locket, and the numbers of her great-grandmother's floor. She read the plans. She read the promise about the two letters. She wrote that autumn to the South Dakota State History Museum in Pierre and asked if they had in their collections any cabin plank from a place called Stonebrook Hollow. The answer came back 3 weeks later on a piece of museum letterhead from a curator who had, the day she received Louise's letter, walked over to the shelf in the corner and lifted down the board that had been sitting there for 2 decades and turned it over and read the two letters again in the light of her own office lamp and understood at last what the letters meant. The museum returned the plank to the family that winter. Bernice Freeman held it in her lap in the living room of her house in Portland on a February afternoon in 1959, with Louise sitting on the arm of the chair beside her and Marcus's daughter Ada in the doorway and Ada's grown son at the table behind them. And she ran her thumb along the two letters cut into the wood, and she did not weep because she was her mother's daughter, and did not weep in front of others, but she did smile slightly at a joke only she was young enough to remember. And she said the sentence her mother had said in front of a strange family in a cabin in Dakota on the last night she ever slept in the country that had taken her husband. Her voice was quiet. It carried nonetheless. This is a house that will not kill you if you sleep. Sleep in it. That is what it is for. The ledger and the little brown book and the plank were donated by the family in 1961 to the newly established African American History Collection at the same university where Louise had by then taken her doctorate. They sit at the time of this telling in a temperature-controlled room on the fourth floor of a research library in the Pacific Northwest, and they are handled twice a year in white cotton gloves by a graduate student writing a dissertation about the domestic technology of the Black frontier, whose name would not in this country have been given to a colored child in Odessa Ridgway's lifetime, and who does not in her own lifetime know why exactly her hands shake a little the first time she turns the ledger to the middle page and reads the single line written in a small, clear hand on the 12th of December, 1881. Odessa Ridgway did not file a patent. She did not put her name on a plan in the county office. She did not in the ledger ever draw the plank floor she built as anything but Ephraim's design, and she meant it that way. And no correction from history will move her hand. She was one woman in one valley in one bad country who understood a thing about heat that no one had asked her to understand, and who paid for that understanding with her husband and her back and a locket her mother-in-law had given her the week of her wedding, and who gave the understanding away freely to any person who would carve two letters into a board before nailing it down. There is, in the Dakota country, no marker for her. The rise she built on has been plowed for wheat since 1939. The cottonwood that was her landmark blew down in the winter of 1952. The town of Blackthorn Ford is a gas station, a diner, and a post office that closes at 3. Somewhere under those wheat fields at the depth of 2 feet, the granite she chose from the northwest outcropping is still holding its cold or its warmth against the ground, the way it did on the night she banked her last fire at 10 p.m. and slept until 5 in a house that had at last taught the country back. And somewhere in a quiet room in a chair, an old woman she never met is showing a great-great-granddaughter a plank of pine with 2 letters cut into it, and she is telling the child in a low voice, pitched exactly the way Odessa's voice was pitched, when it mattered the sentence Odessa wrote on a December night in a cabin whose fire had gone out, the sentence that started everything that came after. Adequate is not enough. Sleep in it. That is what it is for.